Hi, and welcome to this Ask the Expert session. I'm Anna Hoffman from the Azure Data team, and today we'll be diving into the real-time analytics using Azure SQL Edge. Now, just a few things before we get started so that you can get the most out of this session. One, you can use the chat to ask questions, and once you ask a question and a moderator approves that question, it will be visible for all attendees, so just something to keep in mind. You can also upvote your questions that you really like to see an answer to using the thumbs up or the like button. And experts are standing by on video as well as on the chat to answer your questions. I'll kind of be tossing some up to our experts and some will be answered in the chat. And at the end of this session, we will provide plenty of resources for you to learn lots more about Azure SQL Edge. Additionally, I just have to cover a few etiquette guidelines. Reminder that this session might be recorded, so make sure you're comfortable with that. And if you want to help our moderators, you can try not to spam or troll or post any inappropriate comments in the chat. That would really help us. And, you know, kind of going along with that, we expect you to adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. And really, this is just to help us create a respectful, friendly, fun, and inclusive experience for everyone. Now, with that said, I want to take a moment to introduce the experts that we have on the call from the greater team. First, we have Vasia, who is a program manager on the Azure Data team. She's actually the main lead speaker of the session you might have seen earlier today, or the session you might see upcoming as we replay it through the rest of Ignite. Then we have Jasraj, who is a principal group software engineering manager. We also have Blake, a senior product marketing manager, and we have Saurabh, who is a principal PM manager, all folks working on Azure Data. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Saurabh to give an overview and recap of the session that we did today. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for taking the time to attend this Ask the Expert session on Azure SQL Edge. Azure SQL Edge, which went into general availability today, is an optimized data engine for IoT and IoT gateways and IoT solutions. SQL Edge is built on the same platform as Microsoft SQL Server and Azure SQL, and it brings the same performance, security, and other benefits like the SQL Server product or SQL Server family of products. In addition to the capabilities which the SQL engine provides, SQL Edge also adds new capabilities around time series data processing, around native data movement to cloud or to a data center target, around AI and ML, around security, around the choice of platform. In a nutshell, SQL Edge provides the same T-SQL surface area as your SQL Server and Azure SQL, providing you the same developer experience, same tooling experience, which makes building edge to cloud solutions relatively easier. SQL Edge, given that it's built on the same platform as SQL Server and Azure SQL Edge, it provides you the same development experience, as I was saying earlier, and surface area to build applications which can span right from the edge all the way to the cloud. So that's a 2-minute spill on SQL Edge. And with that, we'll open up for questions. Right. While we are waiting for the questions to, for our moderators to go through the question list, a quick call out on the resources and the call to action. If you are interested in learning more about Azure SQL Edge and the services or the capabilities in the product, refer to aka.ms/SQL Edge. Try out SQL Edge from the marketplace. And we have 2 more digital breakout sessions happening, one happening later today in the evening, and then one happening tomorrow morning. And then the documentation for SQL Edge is available on docs.microsoft.com/Azure/Azure SQL Edge. We'll leave the resources page on the screen for you guys to take a note of. Anna, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Saurabh. Now, I'm waiting for some questions to come through, but in the meantime, I did get a few questions from Twitter throughout the day, so we're going to start with some of those. Please feel free to drop your questions in. In the meantime, we'll be monitoring them. Now, a question I saw a few times today on Twitter was around Azure SQL Edge versus SQL Server. So I think it would be great if you could start by sharing, maybe Saurabh, what can I do today with Azure SQL Edge that I couldn't do with SQL Server?
Right, so that's a good question, Anna. And so first things first, right? SQL Edge is built using the same engine as Microsoft SQL Server, just a more latest, newer version of the engine. So some of the functionality which SQL Edge provides are also available in Microsoft SQL Server. But in addition to that, what we have done with SQL Edge is we have added some key capabilities which are absolutely needed or required for an IoT solution. Things around time series data analysis, things around data streaming, right? Those are net new features in the product. And then from a platform point of view, we also have support for ARM64 platforms, which makes, which is obviously not present in SQL Server today, right? So those are some of the things in terms of functionality and capabilities. And then there are some differences in terms of, the size of the product or the startup memory footprint, which is considerably small for Azure SQL Edge when compared to SQL Server. Remember, the target for Azure SQL Edge is these IoT devices, IoT gateways, which are generally smaller in size, less computing resources, and in terms of memory and CPU. And as such, having a full-blown SQL engine which starts with 2 gigs of memory is probably not the right thing, right? That's where SQL Edge comes into play with its startup memory of about less than 400 megs. It really solves that requirement around IoT and IoT scenarios.
Awesome. Thanks, Saurabh. We just got a question in, which I think you kind of have already addressed, so I think it's a good follow-up question. Diego says, by saying that it has the same capabilities, how do you manage the fact that it's going to be executing on the edge, so it, like you were mentioning, has a lot less memory and storage?
Right. So if I understand the question correctly, I'm assuming the question is more around how do you manage the resource consumptions or you manage the internal operations of the SQL database engine, given that it has low memory and CPUs, right? It's not that SQL Edge cannot access more memory. When I say smaller footprint, it's about the startup memory footprint of SQL Edge. That's one thing, right? And as and when your workload increases or you're trying to process more workload, the memory requirements for that particular workload processing would increase. Now, on a smaller device, it obviously can become a challenge if you're trying to process a large workload with a huge amount of data, and memory and CPU is constrained, right? So there, what we have done is to make that processing a bit more smoother, we have tried to scale back in how SQL allocates memory, in how SQL allocates or determines its plans or query plans and so on and so forth. So those smaller optimizations in the engine helps us take care of some of the processing constraints which those devices have.
Awesome. Thanks, Saurabh. Diego, we hope that helped answer your question. Now, if we think about these capabilities that you've talked about, one thing I've gotten questioned on is, okay, so we have done some stuff different to make it run, performantly at the edge. But when we think about indexing and partitioning, like, are those sort of capabilities still available? Like, is it still kind of SQL Server?
Yes, absolutely. So from a storage point of view, from data access point of view, from your index maintenance point of view, everything is the same, right? Remember, it's the same SQL engine, right? So all of those capabilities are the same with some added or some new features to make it more applicable to IoT scenarios. There are obviously some things which we had to scale down, like I was talking about earlier, to align with these constrained devices. But majority of the things, when a user interacts with SQL Edge, they wouldn't see a difference between SQL Edge and SQL Server. In the way they interact, in the way they write their queries, in the way they design their tables and all of that, that would still be pretty much the same.
Cool. So whether it's on the edge, in the ground, on the cloud, it's just SQL. I like that.
It's just SQL, exactly, yes.
Awesome. Okay, now another question I've been hearing is that, this is great, but do we have customers that are using this, and what are our customers in today potentially using this in production? Blake, I think this might be something you can help with.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two great case studies that are on our website. The first one featuring Zeiss in a connected factory scenario. And they've been using SQL Edge to gain just that speed and efficiency to be able to detect anomalies on their manufacturing line and be able to process it and analyze everything right there in real time on the manufacturing floor. And what that does is allows them just a little bit of latency in order to get that speed. They're able to use their on-prem servers. They're also able to use Azure SQL in the cloud as well. And they use those for big data clusters and kind of big machine learning. And then they're able to deploy those right down to the factory floor. So they're able to get just a little bit more latency, a little bit more speed. And they saw an actual 20% increase in their production capacity by deploying SQL Edge on the floor.
Awesome. Thanks, Blake. Now we have another question again from Diego. Thanks, Diego, for your question. This question is there a sync mechanism between a cloud Azure SQL and Azure SQL Edge? And then I think this is a follow-up question. Can it run, I lost the question. Can it run on its own like a replacement of SQLite? So the question, just to summarize again, is there a sync mechanism between cloud and Azure SQL Edge? And can it run on its own like a replacement to SQLite, which is open source?
So I'll take the first part of the question first around the data synchronization or the data sync. So absolutely, yes, we do have mechanisms which allow you to sync data from edge to the cloud. And these mechanisms could be either cloud hosted or it could be edge hosted, right? Providing you the flexibility in designing a solution the way you would want to, right? Now, the second part is around SQLite. So there are a few differences between what SQLite does and what SQL Edge is, right? SQLite is more of an embedded application embeddable database. It's a very small, lightweight database which resides within the application space. SQL Edge, on the other hand, it's more like the traditional RDBMS system, which works in this client-server kind of configuration, where you have client applications accessing the data from the SQL or the database server, right? So as such, SQL is not app embeddable per se, but to the point of can it run in in a standalone manner without any involvement or a lot of DBA time? Yes, absolutely. The way we have designed SQL Edge and the way the containerized platform we offer SQL Edge on makes it much more easier for you to run SQL Edge with minimal management overhead.
Awesome. Thanks, Saurabh. Now, this next question comes from Vin. He says, how can I safely and with very little downtime keep Azure SQL Edge up to date in my fleet of IoT devices?
So that's a good question. And updating SQL is pretty much SQL Edge is pretty much just one single command, which could either be scheduled or could be manually executed. So we offer SQL Edge in multiple different deployment modes, right? One through IoT Edge, the other one in a standalone Docker container format or in a Kubernetes cluster format, right? And all it takes to update the SQL Edge image is to download the latest container or to pull the latest container from our repository. Once you pull the image, whether through a scheduled mechanism or through a manual mechanism, that's about it. The underlying platform will pick up the new image and restart the SQL Edge containers with the new binary bits.
Awesome. So it's pretty easy, and it sounds like it's something I can set up to be done kind of automatically, or I can, do it on my own schedule.
Yes.
Now, this next question we have is anonymous, and the question is, what are the security implications for accessing SQL Edge externally or remotely?
So from a SQL engine point of view, it's the same as you would access SQL Server or Azure SQL from a remote connection point, from a remote client or a remote connection, right? You can configure these connections to be encrypted, and you can also use data encryption or always encrypted technologies in SQL to ensure that your entire communication between the client and SQL is all encrypted. Now, the other thing you can do is data encryption at rest using transparent data encryption to make sure that even if somebody got unauthorized access to the actual IoT device, your data is still secure, right? So those are the two things which SQL Edge offers out of the box. Now, the third thing is in terms of physical device security, where you obviously need to take those best practices into account to disable all unwanted ports, to only limit connections from a particular set of IPs, to use hardware BitLocker encryption kind of things. So all of those best practices which are available in terms of device encryption and device protection, those needs to be followed.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks, Saurabh. Okay, so this next question is from Xavier, and he says, are there tools available to monitor performance and debug?
Yes, again, the same tools which you are used to with working with SQL or SQL Server or Azure SQL, those same tools work with SQL Edge. So all the client tools, all the debugging tools, all the perf measurement tools, all of those would work as is with SQL Edge. The only caveat to that would be there might be certain features or capabilities which are available in SQL Server, but we have not ported those in SQL Edge. Those queries against those or trying to access those capabilities may not be available, or you may not be able to use that. But all in all, from a perf measurement perspective, from a tooling perspective, the same tools work with SQL Edge.
Got it. Okay, good to know. Now, this next one is kind of a long one. This is a scenario, though, so I'm kind of looking forward to it. It says, I am working for a medical device company. Our machines generate a lot of data while interacting with patients. With SQL Edge deployed to the machines, is it possible for the SQL Edge to store all that data locally so that owners of our machines could run some analytics reports that we deployed to the machines based on that data stored in Edge? And then the second part is it also possible that SQL Edge can pass the data back to the cloud for further analytics?
Yes, on both accounts. So you can store the data locally with SQL Edge. There is no limit. I mean, the standard limits of a database size for SQL Server apply to SQL Edge also, but that's in the range of some 32 odd terabytes or something like that, right? And then with column store compression, that makes it even more better with, you can get easily about 15 to 20 times compression. So from a storage point of view, you're practically limited by the amount of storage on the device, right, for SQL Edge. And then we offer, as I was talking about earlier in terms of data synchronization and data movement capabilities, there are capabilities you can build to, or you can use to sync this data back to a cloud target or a data center target for long-term retention, scale analytics, and stuff like that.
Awesome, thanks. And that relates to another question that I see that is, can I move data from Azure SQL Edge to a data lake like something like Synapse?
Yes, absolutely. And Synapse being our, the analytics story in Azure, yes, you can definitely move data from SQL Edge to Synapse. In fact, over the weekend, I actually wrote a simple code which does that. And it's easy to deploy, it's containerized format. You can tweak that around to either write directly to Synapse or to Event Hub, and then from there to Synapse, so on and so forth. There are a lot of options available which you can use to write data to Synapse.
Awesome. That's really cool. I'll have to try that out. I haven't tried that. This next question is, what OS are supported? Windows IoT Core, Linux, Android? So there were a few questions in there.
Good questions again. So yes, we today support Linux as the primary. The container SQL Edge containers are built on Ubuntu 18.04. So the recommended host for SQL Edge is Linux, Ubuntu 18.04 or Ubuntu 20.04, but you can still deploy it on Windows devices with either Docker desktop or using equivalent container engine. And the same support policies as with Azure IoT Edge apply with SQL Edge when deployed through Azure IoT Edge.
Awesome, thanks. Now we have a question from Young, and this is kind of a theme I'm seeing among some of the other questions. He says, is machine learning services available in SQL Edge? Can I run R and or Python code using something like a stored procedure?
So what you're referring to is the ML capabilities which we exposed back in SQL 2016 with external scripts through R and Python. What we offer in SQL Edge is a native implementation of the Onyx runtime, which is the Open Neural Network Exchange runtime, which basically allows you to write actual ML model in R or Python or a language or toolkit of your choice. It could be PyTorch, it could be Azure ML, it could be TensorFlow, it could be Skagit, it could be anything, right? And convert that model into Onyx framework or Onyx format, and then you can deploy that model to SQL Edge for inferencing. We do not offer the same style of ML inferencing as we offered in SQL Server, because one of the things was that the R and Python libraries, they are pretty big in, and consume a lot of space. So that would have made the SQL Edge image sizes significantly larger. And in scenarios where you have bandwidth constraints or disk size constraints, that does not really help. So that's why we opted to go with the Onyx runtime with SQL Edge.
Got it. Okay, so this next question is from Sergi, and I'm not sure of the answer. I'm curious what your take is going to be on it. He says, is it possible to apply high availability features like read-only instances on premises for employing computing and analytic tasks without loading the main DB?
I am assuming the question refers to always-on availability group capabilities in SQL Server. We do not offer always-on availability groups in SQL Edge, and you cannot extend a SQL Server availability group to SQL Edge as a read-only or a read-only replica. So that mechanism does not exist today. And there are reasons why it does not exist, primarily because there are certain features in SQL Server which we deemed are not applicable to an edge scenario where you have constrained devices. And as such, if your databases are using those functionality, you obviously cannot ship that data to SQL Edge, using always-on availability groups. But assuming that's what the question was referring to.
I think so. I'm not exactly sure. So Sergi, if you want to reply and follow up with a clarification, we'll try to respond in the chat. Just so everyone knows, we do have about 5 minutes left. So if you do have a question, go ahead and put your question in, because we'll be out of time before you know it. In the meantime, I have another question here from Vin. He says, can we monitor SQL Edge with Azure Sentinel?
Oh, that's a good question. That's we haven't really explored Azure Sentinel in association with SQL Edge yet, but that's definitely some of the, one of the few things which is in our agenda or our plan going forward. So look out for more information around Azure Sentinels, Azure SQL Edge in the near future.
Got it. And Azure Sentinel is pretty new. I think, is that like new this week?
I am actually not sure.
That's okay.
Blake might be aware of it, but yeah.
You don't have to answer that question. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Okay, here we go. We have a question from Evan. He says, what are the top industries you are focusing on for SQL Edge?
Blake, do you want to take that question?
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right in your ad.
Yeah, no problem. Quote unquote, the edge, cuts across a lot of industries. Over the past year, we've been in an early adopter program, and what we've seen a lot of adoption come through is very much manufacturing. Azure as a whole really kind of leans on strength within manufacturing, and I mentioned the Zeiss example earlier as an example of that. And we have a number of both smaller and medium-sized manufacturers as large manufacturers in a different number of settings. A lot of factory of the future. Some manufacturers are kind of getting intermittent service, so they're not always connected, or they're merging two data sets from two different manufacturing locations that may or may not be synced and may have different types of connectivity. So seeing a lot of pickup in there. Energy as well, as you can imagine, wind farms, remote wind farms, ocean data exploration, places at the extreme remote edge. Again, where connectivity, may be an issue. They love the power that Azure SQL Edge brings to that for energy, remote energy maintenance, kind of remote factory workers, stuff like that. Automotive, I posted a link earlier for a white paper for smart cars. We have some great examples for automotive as well. Retail, point of sale systems, the fact that this can run on ARM devices, is great for handheld devices, great for inventory management, great for tablets. And so there's a lot of versatility that we're seeing, but I would say primarily the first ones that come to mind: manufacturing, energy, automotive, and retail.
Awesome. Thanks, Blake. Hopefully that helped answer your question. Now, this next question, it might be our last question. I might be able to sneak one last one in. From Young, he says, any notification trigger API when the stream data is coming or how live data is displayed?
So we do not have native visualization, or visualization inbuilt into the SQL engine or SQL Edge engine, but you can definitely write notifications or create notifications to alert in case of new data arriving through the streaming layer. Today, the streaming layer reads from IoT Hub, Edge Hub, and Kafka, and then we are obviously working on building more input and output pairs for SQL Edge.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Saurabh. And I think that's all the time we have for questions for today. I want to remind you of the resources that we have available for you to learn more. We put some in the chat, and we also have some on this slide you see on your screen. And, we hope this session was useful. We hope you reach out to us if you need further help, and we hope to see you in future sessions at Ignite and hopefully sometime soon. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Or evening.
Sorry. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night or evening.